I'm going to press the record button now, so it's recording.
Okay, thanks.
Where do you get that? Yes. Is the pet screen made out of metal?
Yeah, it's just like the stuff that's in
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we talked when I got home last night. I was like, so what did you learn? Like, oh, we got these vent covers.
Yeah.
Which I looked up today and sent him a link for. And he said our biggest thing, we don't have, we took all our off years ago.
Yeah.
And now we have wood, which is maybe a little better, but there's certain plenty of premises that are getting.
Yeah, God, on my house, there are. We're looking at all that. I didn't realize how my house was oriented to the north. We thought just in the property next to the property here, me and my other. Just like this little system comes down the hill and goes into the. It's very awesome creek, the one that's concrete, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That runs along the west side, between west side and middle. Yeah, so it runs down there. It goes up, and that's all facing. So we're like, okay, if he's Marshall's saying our biggest threat is from the north, that's what we really have to look at. Is that channel right there? So we're gonna,
Yeah, ours is our creek up in front of our house runs north.
yeah.
But now our big thing was we're sitting up.
Yeah.
Now they're gonna be getting that out.
Okay, should I take this down then?
Yeah. That's awesome. And he didn't have.
And also have all these years.
We can take it around.
Okay, that's appreciated.
Funny meeting you. Yeah.
Just tell me when I should start
All
rolling.
right.
Well, we're live right now, so.
I think I'm gonna come Thursday, so I'm doing college.
Oh, interesting. Oh, yeah.
I'll do this.
Sort of the psychological impact, you know.
Sir.
Did you get your car?
No, but the toughest shows on there, pretty sure.
Oh, good.
You probably want to turn the lights on for this one.
I don't know how to do this. Start at 5.
Oh, well, Brad said you can have that. That's cool. Yeah.
I need to hit you guys up for one of those books for my boy.
Oh, yeah, the Odin.
Yeah,
Odin's
we have
great.
a Great Pyrenees Anatolian puppy. My boy's 3.
The dog bigger than the boy.
Oh yeah, way bigger.
Already.
He can ride him if he wants to, and he has done that several times, which is terrifying. But
That was one of the great stories.
all right.
But I think we were all looking for the positives and everything. Hearing about that dog was just awesome.
Are you ready to go? Because I'm not going to go do this.
Ready whenever you want me to start.
Can someone hit the lights for me? They're right over here. Guys. Where is that door?
Here?
No, behind, to your left-hand side, Grant. Left-hand side? I mean, your left-hand. Hold on. Right. There you go. Yeah, see, when you turn it on. people's gonna follow me.
Sounds good. Yeah, just tell me when you want me to start. Right. All right. I think that's pretty good. Hello all, my name is Sheikh Hassoul. I'm going to be talking a little bit today about what I call the 3 legs of fire fuel mitigation, of the stool of fire fuel mitigation. And that is manual, which is chainsaws, weed eaters, hand tools. That's grazing, and that's prescribed fire. Established my credentials. I'm a 7th generation rancher out of Bodega. My family has tended our property for 170 years. I am a wildland firefighter with the Good Fire Alliance, and I am the CEO of Circuit Rider Community Services, where we take young people and we pay them a good living wage to go out in the community and create change in our natural environment that has some kind of positive effect. Obviously, right now, a lot of that is with fire fuel mitigation. So let's talk a little bit about like growing up and historical knowledge, right? When I was growing up, we had animals that wandered through our property. We would rotationally graze, and then once the animals left a field, we would walk in with my grandfather, who was highly technical, prescribed fire. My grandfather with his pipe and his shovel, and he would light his pipe and then throw the match into tall fescue, Medusa head, or some blackberry, whatever invasive species the animals didn't want to eat, and he would burn it down. And then if it got out of hand, he'd whack it with his shovel and swear a lot. And that's kind of how we practiced prescribed fire, but it was still something we could do. And then following my grandmother around in the off season, right? Of course, I was the free labor. So I would follow her around, and she'd be out there with her loppers and her pole saw. And her refrain was always, "You never stop clearing because it always grows back. You never stop clearing because it always grows back." And so I say those stories when I do these presentations to tell you that if my 80-year-old grandparents can do it, we don't have a lot of excuses, do we? So when it comes to that manual piece, my grandmother with her loppers, one of the issues in our community is that manual chainsaws, weed eaters, is wildly expensive. It's something that we're all really comfortable with. It's something that we see with the PG&E subcontractors on the side of the road every day. It's something that we may have hired somebody to do or that we do ourselves on our own properties. But the county estimates that it costs about $5,000 per acre to treat our forest land. Well, you can do $1,000 per acre and you can do $10,000 an acre, and it's going to show either way. But for someone like me, I have 200 acres that we run animals on. 90 acres of that is forest land. I am a rancher and a social worker. Both of these are nonprofit industries. I cannot afford $5,000 an acre for 90 acres. So what are some of the other tools that we have? And I'm not saying that manual doesn't have its place. It's a very useful tool. People like my neighbor who actually has some means can pay to have their entire property treated. But obviously I can't. I treat my roadways and around my homes. So let's talk about prescribed fire. As I said, I'm a wildland firefighter, certified wildland firefighter, but I don't have the vast experience that a lot of these CAL FIRE guys do. I do my own prescribed burns, 3 acres or less on my property. I've had the Good Fire Alliance out. I've had CAL FIRE out to burn on my property. And it's a great tool. It's a wildly affordable tool once you put good fire on the ground to clear space. One of the things that we say in fire fuel mitigation is that you want to imitate a low fire. Well, what better way to imitate a low fire than literally have a low fire on the ground? But the problem with the prescribed burn is the weather. It's not humans. So this year, as an example, I'm waiting to do a prescribed burn. I'm waiting to do a prescribed burn. And then we got 13 inches of rain all at once. Well, that was game over. I'm not going to be able to burn anymore. Now we've had this section where we could start burning again, and we only have such finite resources to put fire on the ground and get people out there to do those burns. There's still these huge queues of people waiting to burn in our community. So it's a wonderful tool. It's a tool that I suggest people explore for their larger landscape level properties, but it also has its limitations. And then I'll talk about my absolute personal favorite, which is grazing. As I said, 7th generation rancher, critters are kind of my bread and butter. And I love putting livestock on the ground because all of the things that we just talked about, right? Fire, manual, they change the composition of the fuels. But when it comes to ruminants, cattle, sheep, goats, they change that composition into something that's nutrient affirming for the landscape and for the ground, right? Well, not only that, and don't get me wrong, these are not wildly affordable experiences. You still have to have, it's roughly about $10 a foot for fencing right now in our community for woven wire, which is what you see on most ranches. But once that woven wire is set up and you're grazing, you can actually make a little bit of money on fire fuel mitigation. Well, you have to think about what you have on your property, right? If you have understory with brush, you're going to want some goats. If you have some pretty heavy grassland, you're going to want some cattle. You might want to have some sheep on there afterwards. And that's how I manage my front field. I have a regional park just on the other side of the highway from me. Well, I look at people almost every August putting out cigarettes on the side of the road. And that makes me pretty scared. We've had some small fires there. So I really, really heavily graze my front field just before the grass turns. And all of that goes down to just a little bit of a nub. And you can literally take a lighter in high August, go up to my front field, light it off, and it'll smoke for a second and go out because there's no fuels there. Grazers are also important in that they help us to manage our non-native species. Our native species are adapted for our really dry, pretty brutal summers. The non-natives aren't. So if we have this heavy, heavy grazing that's rotationally based, and then we move the animals on in our drier months, well, they're going to eat everything down. The non-natives are not going to be able to come back and compete. The natives with their 40 or 50 foot deep roots are going to be able to resprout and come back, and then we do that cycle again. So good for the environment, pull more carbon down into the ground. And not to be too crass, but let's talk about the economics of it too, right? As I said, you can make some money on it. You can also have a full freezer. What's a better way to deal with your fire fuels than have a full freezer and feed your family and friends? But it's also not rocket science. People have this in their head that it's really hard to manage animals. This is from someone that loves animals, that works with them every day. It's not. If you can read a book, if you can use Google, managing animals is not that hard, especially when it comes to ruminants that you work with them every 6 months. You make sure their hooves are good. You give them their ivermectin and whatever meds that they need. As an example, when I first started with cattle, I was really nervous. I didn't know what I was doing with cattle. So I would buy feeder steers in October, November, put them on the land, and come June or July, when that grass turned and stopped being so green and lost a lot of those nutrients, the local harvester, ranch harvester, would come out, take those animals off my property, and they would come back wrapped to me in my own particular cut and wrap. I like my cuts made a certain way, right? So your T-bones, 2-inch thick T-bones. What's not to love about that? I'm a diver. I love our ocean. Oh, suddenly all of the things that I'm consuming now are wrapped up in paper instead of plastic that is required by the USDA when you go to the store. But also you have the experience of selling these animals. I sell very cheaply to my family and friends, but I buy animals, and apparently can buy them at this price, for $1,200 in October, November. I'd sell $2,500 to $3,000 when we harvested. So there's an element of let's make some money, let's treat our landscape in a very passive way. You can just sit there and, we call our place bucolic because of its wonderful agricultural properties. Why not add and sit there and watch our animals at work? So when I talk about manual prescribed fire and grazing, I don't want there to be a be all end all, because we have this problem in our community that we're all really siloed and we really believe in one thing. And at least in my limited experience, it doesn't seem like any property is appropriate for just one thing. Almost never. We have to come in and look at a property and say, and that's the way I'm training my young people is, well, let's do manual around this area to make it safe to burn. Once that's burned out, well, we have some understory that's going to regrow. Well, that's going to be better for the graze. Let's put animals on year to year to manage that property and rotate through. So that's kind of my hope and my vision that you'll take away from this, is that you'll explore prescribed fire, you'll explore grazing. We already know about manual. I think everybody is probably familiar with the sound of chainsaws at this point. And then I'll leave you with my rant on bays real quick, which is we have a big issue with fur encroachment and bay encroachment in our community. But a lot of people don't understand some of the issues that come along with those two trees. When they grow really closely together, they not only kill everything below them because their leaves and their needles are so oily and so acidic, but when we have bay, we also have the most important foliar for sudden oak. Bay trees get sudden oak, doesn't kill them, and they continue to spread. I, in my lifetime, have seen all of our oak woodland on our 200-acre ranch completely destroyed as they slowly moved up from the creeks that was their previous domain and took over the ridge lines. And now almost all of our oaks are just these rotting hulks. And that's not good for our environment. That's not good for fire. Acorns are one of the most important food sources for animals in our community. So when I say, bays are evil, people get really upset, but I say that somewhat farcically, but if you have a chance to clear out some of the bays around an oak, for the love of God, please do, because you can protect that oak, keep that sudden oak away, and it won't get shaded out as those things build up. Another issue with bay trees is that we have a conch, an artist conch, which you've often seen like the shelf mushroom on them. Those mushrooms actually hollow out those trees as they get older. And now, having seen this in person during the prescribed fire, it blew my mind. They'll hollow the tree out all the way up and create somewhat of a chimney. It's nice and dry, right? Perfect for embers to get inside. Well, when that lights off, anybody that's familiar with a chimney fire, you've heard that noise. It sounds like a freight train, just whoosh, as oxygen gets pulled up into that chimney and kicked out the top. But with these bay trees, they're not only doing that in acreage-wide swaths, but they're kicking up embers into the air that are now being able to be picked up by the wind and spread a much further distance. So, ending with a little bit of a dark rant on bay trees, but please get out there with your loppers. If my grandma can do it, you all can too. And then consider prescribed fire, consider grazing, consider manual, and where they are appropriate for your properties. Thank you. Yes, sir.
When you're talking about bay trees, we have tons of them, and we've chopped them down. Of course, they just sprout out at the bottom again. I mean, we've tried everything, and the only thing I found the worst is that one until it dies. But is there a better way to kill these things? Because especially if they're big, it's almost impossible to kill it.
Without painting it, the two best options are, I actually will cut them a little bit higher because it stretches them out a little bit more. And you either pile all of the material on them and you pile burn right on top of that stump, which is labor intensive, but also a little fun. Bring the mushroom, the s'more makings. And then you can also, once again, when it comes to grazing, new bay is so acidic and so awful that nothing will eat it. But if you cut a bay and it resprouts, go and pull it. I'm sure we're all have seen some bays that are resprouting. Pull those leaves out and smell them. They're not nearly as acidic. And goats will go to town on those things. So if you fence and put goats on property or Scottish Highland cattle, they will actually eat that back down.
But I thought about getting rid of the termite thing, like
Painting or pile burning.
what painting? What does that mean?
That means that you have to get an applicator's license and use some chemicals that are rather unfortunate.
Oh, okay.
But bays are one of the most difficult species to get rid of. And you basically have to just keep coming back and hacking away at it.
What was the place of the bay of the California ecosystem before Western people started to change?
Well, when you do a burn, you have these what we call dog hair, right? They're the really thin, really small bays.
Right.
And so when that low burn comes through, it generally wipes all of them out. It'll kill them. But some of them will be more established, especially down in the valleys and wetter areas.
Right.
So that's kind of where, at least when I was growing up, you would only see bays in the bottom of the valleys because it didn't burn very hot down there. There was a lot of wet. Now you're starting to see them move up a lot more. And then with these droughts, they're getting super stressed and they're even struggling a little bit on the top of the ridges because they need a lot of water. And, it does become a lot scarier for fire. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all very much. Oh, one more.
So what do you think about the feral pigs with, they're not grazers, they're not, what effect do the feral pigs have on our landscape?
Not only are they really quite horrific for our erosion and for a lot of our native species. They are another non-native species, just like any other plant or tree. And there's this interesting juxtaposition in the eco work that I do, where everyone's fine with taking out the non-native tree or the non-native bush, but when it comes to a really destructive animal, they have a little bit more of an issue. I personally believe that trapping them is the best way to take care of the animals. I've worked with folks that did so on Jenner headlands. I've had some success myself. I've hunted a lot, even hunted just past your property and not done very well because pigs are real smart, but the trapping does seem to be the only way to go.
And we have got deer on the property as far as ranges. We don't have elk anymore.
Yeah, and so that's what our ecology was designed for, right? Was to be burned and then have these large ruminant herds that came through and then be burned, and it was this cyclical experience. Since human beings set foot in our area, there's been a conservation mentality, not a preservation mentality. And then we have reintroduced preservation. Oh, just don't touch it and leave it alone. Well, it doesn't work very well as we're experiencing. Deer, you'd have to have a really concentrated herd, which is not going to happen anymore because we don't have those huge wide open spaces where they can congregate and move through. So it really does have to be, in my opinion, and I'm biased because I am a rancher, concentrated rotational grazing.
So I go out and get goat. And I put it in what size of area, like what area would I fence off?
So the UC Cooperative has Stephanie Larson as a resource, someone that will come out and help you talk about what you want to do to your property. We'll get you hooked up with the RCDs and RCS to help you fence, put water infrastructure in, help get you either, if you want people to graze your property, see if they can find somebody to graze your property, which I'm going to be honest with you is harder than you would think, because not a lot of people want to go out and do that. Or if you want to run animals yourself, help you resource those animals, where the best to buy them from. I would not say the auction. That is not a good place to buy unless you want sick animals. And then put them on your property. I am more than happy to come out to any of your properties, come talk to you about what you have on site. This is a passion of mine. I love it. And see if we can not only mitigate the fire fuels on your property, but also help to feed your family and your community. Because if COVID has taught us anything, the supply chain is stressed already. And having that full freezer, I'll tell you folks, definitely made me a lot more comfortable that I knew my family was taken care of. All right, thank you all very much for having me. Really appreciate it.
My name is Chris Heinzelman. I'm one of 4 environmental scientists for the Sonoma-Mendocino Coast District of State Parks. Our district is from Bodega Head all the way up to McCarricker in Fort Bragg, and then Armstrong and Austin Creek. So it's about 12 park units, about 40,000 acres of land, and a lot of acres to take care of. So I will be talking about fire management in the West Sonoma County State Parks, specifically the impacts of the Walbridge Fire on Austin Creek State Recreation Area and Armstrong Woods State Natural Reserve. By and large, we were really lucky with this fire, with how it moved through the landscape towards the parks. It was more of a backing and flanking fire, and that was mostly because of where it started in relationship to the park and how the wind was pushing it. And then also the fact that we didn't have that much wind on this particular event. Go to the next slide.
Can you speak up a little?
Yes.
Thank you.
So just at a glance, the Walbridge Fire, flaming started fire August 17th. It was 55,000 acres total. About 3,801 acres of Austin Creek burned in that fire, which was 64% of that park. 511 acres of Armstrong burnt in that fire, which was about 68 acres, or 68% of that park. Within Armstrong, it was a very low intensity burn. It was either low intensity or very low intensity based off of the mapping that CAL FIRE took. And then in Austin Creek, there was more patches of moderate burn. But all of that was kind of predicted because of the topography and the type of vegetation that was in that park. So in Austin Creek, we have a lot of chamise and Sargent cypress and other chaparral species, which if they burn hot. That's what they're adapted to do. And that plant community will honestly benefit from that kind of fire. And then in other areas where the fire was working slowly downhill, or the wind was pushing it the opposite direction that the hillside was kind of making it move in, it was just a very low, slow moving fire that honestly looked like a prescribed fire and was would have the kind of fire effects that we would hope for in this kind of event. Existing roads and trails served as control lines within the park, which is a real good thing for us. A lot of damage from wildfires to parklands comes from the suppression efforts when they run bulldozers down ridge lines or along valley bottoms. But we were able to work with fire services and actually got into the parks ahead of the fire and help to direct and just kind of direct our suppression efforts. Suppression damage in Austin Creek was a little bit more extensive, and it was because of where the dozers had actually gone and done the work. They had spent a good amount of time in Gilliam Creek itself trying to stop the fire there, and that caused the most, I would say, significant ecological damage from this event. But we were able to work with fire services and repair that to the best of our ability. So, a typical state park response to a fire is we get brought in after the flaming front has moved through the area, and we serve in the function called a resource advisor. So we're working with the heavy equipment operators and the suppression repair unit of the fire, and we help to direct whatever kind of repair efforts are needed. So it's really knocking down like berms. You can think of it as repairing like a really poorly designed road, trying to reduce the chances of erosion, that sort of thing. In this fire services were so stretched thin and the fire activity was so low in the park, they actually let us in while the fire was still active in there. My boss and myself and several of our colleagues are all firefighters. We're all been trained as resource advisors. And we have equipment, so we were able to respond and actually act on the suppression side of the event as well, which is a unique experience for us. So this map shows the fire intensity of the wall bridge and more in relationship to the parks. So all the blue is very low to pretty much no burn activity. The green is low intensity. This color brown is the moderate, and then a few patches of red, but those are mostly outside of parkland. So the patches of brown that are in Austin Creek, again, that was mainly because of the vegetation type that it was burning through. And when chaparral burns, it just burns hot. Around Bullfrog Campground, it burned pretty hot too, despite that being more of a mixed conifer forest. And that was because of the topography. It was in a little shallow canyon, and the fire just builds on itself in that kind of setting and ran up the ridge pretty fast and pretty hot. But overall, the fire intensity, we really lucked out on it within the park. Next slide. So this map shows some of the control lines that were used during the park or during the fire. The purple was all existing roads that they just improved, which really just means they ran a bulldozer down it, widened it up, cleared it of any veg within the road prism, and just made it easier for engines to drive on. And some of the orange lines, it says it's completed bulldozer line, but a lot of that was in fact existing roads that they just improved on. Where it wasn't existing roads was that line, this line, and then down in Gilliam Creek behind the, yeah, the turn off of that.
Is Sweetwater Springs Road on the,
Sweetwater Springs, I believe, would be over in this area, right? But the way I organize the data, it doesn't show up on this map. And then down here in Armstrong, this is a little hand line that they put in. We had a retired ranger who still works up in North Coast Humboldt. He's on the volunteer fire department. He participates in their prescribed fires, but he came down and helped out with this event, and he was actually out with the hand crew that was putting in that line and helped direct exactly where they were going so that they didn't cut down any trees unnecessarily, and they put in the lowest impact hand line that they could possibly do. Because that was, in addition to a high intensity fire, the next concern on our list was suppression impacts. And we really wanted to avoid having bulldozers in Armstrong at all, and then to just really minimize their use wherever possible. And fortunately, the fire behavior really lends itself to that. Versus, are any of you familiar with Santa Cruz and Big Basin and the way the fire impacted that? So they were unfortunate with just how the fire started in relationship to their park. And then there was this hot air mass that was off the coast that came in and just had really strong dry winds with it. And it burned, like it just pushed it right over that park within a matter of 24 hours. And again, for us up here, we were on the flank of the fire. And so we never had it pushed directly into us like that. So you might be wondering what a low intensity fire looks like. This is what it is. So you can see it's obviously burning up there, but it's not getting into the canopies of the trees. It's just staying down on the ground. This is the rig that I was driving during a lot of the fire. And you can see the fire just creeping down the hillside towards you, just going real slow. And that was, if this was a prescribed fire, I couldn't have asked for better fire behavior. And it just, it's doing its job of cleaning up a lot of the material on the floor, cleaning up the leaf litter, the small diameter branches, and just making it, just making it a little bit cleaner of a forest. Next slide. So this was some work down at the Colonel Armstrong tree. The fire was backing down the hill. We wanted to prevent any scorching on this tree, so we did a light scratch line around it, and then Cal Fire helped to kind of tend the fire and bring it down through the grove, because especially with this low intensity fire, this was going to really benefit this forest. It was going to reduce the risk of a future high intensity fire. It was going to create more area for germination from redwoods. They have really small seeds that don't last long in high organic content soil. They suffer from fungus really badly. So having this more bare mineral soil is a really good thing for regeneration of the coast live oaks, of the coast redwoods. And again, we know that everyone was rightfully concerned with the natural resources in the park. And this is what we did to really make this as beneficial of an event to them as possible. So these are just some more pictures. I tried to make this a picture heavy presentation. So just some more pictures of the low intensity fire creeping down the hill, coming down towards our existing roads and trails. The fire services did a lot of hose lay along our trails, just because, again, the fire, with just a little bit of babysitting, it was going to stay exactly where we wanted it to stay. This log, some of you may recognize, it's right along the Discovery Trail. And it's, you know, a really iconic spot of that trail. And this was a fascinating thing to watch because we decided to put it out because of how iconic it is to the park experience. But as we were watching and discussing it, we could see that if we had let that log burn, it was up against another large tree that would have likely been brought down because of the fire at it burning out its base. And so it would have just been kind of like a shuffling of the deck. You know, I think we would have lost this specific log, but then a new one would have come down, and it was just the numbers of all the different features would have stayed relatively the same. It was just the specific ones would have kind of changed. So it's just a fascinating thing to kind of wrap our heads around, seeing the impacts of the fires. But again, we put it out because we wanted to keep that iconic log there and have it still be around for people to enjoy. Slide. So during the event, again, fire services were stretched incredibly thin. And one of the products that came out of that was this Geyser 1 hand crew. And this was an on-call hand crew that got created. There was a lot of members of the Good Fire Alliance and then other members that of the community who have fire experience, but weren't like a fire professional at the time. And they acted as a type 2 hand crew. And they spent several days in our parks hotspotting. So they were grid searching the hillside, looking for areas like roots or half-buried logs or large trees with like a basal hollow in them that still had heat in it. And they were just trying to mop that up and put it out so that there weren't flare-ups some point later that would require a response from an engine. So they found several trees that had their basal hollows on fire, and we put water on them to keep them cool. And it was, both to prevent any kind of flare-ups that would require any kind of future response from fire services, and then also to minimize the number of old growth trees that were brought down because of the fire, which it did happen, but it was pretty minimal overall. So yeah, that was a really fascinating group, and they're still around. They do a lot of prescribed fires now, and last season they had their on-call crew, which fortunately wasn't needed because our fire activity was relatively low last year. So that was lucky. Slide. So after the fire, we go into suppression repair mode. So we would bring in resource advisors from out of district because we just didn't have the capacity to handle it with only district staff. They would go out and map all the suppression lines and come up with recommendations for what kind of repair we would need to do on them. There's a lot of hazard tree mitigation and cleanup. So during the fire, there was several felling modules, which is a couple people with chainsaws who would go through and remove trees that were at an imminent risk to failure and coming down on crossroads. So either posing a risk by actually striking, a vehicle or a person, or blocking the road and making access hard. And then cleaning up all of that material, because these modules would just put the trees down on the ground and eliminate that risk, but then all the slash and everything was left. Cal OES came in several months after the fire and did another round of hazard tree assessment. Their criteria was looking at trees that may fail over a 5-year span. And then they would remove those trees and take the material to a cogeneration plant and burn it for electricity. They removed about 3,300 trees from the park. The vast majority of them were 6 to 11 inches in diameter. Most of them were small Doug firs, which for fuel management were the exact trees that we should be targeting for removal. I believe 53% of the total trees removed were in that size class. Then 26% of the trees were in the 12 inches to 16 inches. And then everything else just dropped off pretty precipitously. There were very few large trees that were removed. And we kept them specifically out of the grove because we didn't want them to take any old growth redwoods out of the park. So we kept them just up along Armstrong Woods Road, and then McCrae Ridge and McMahon Road. Those are the areas that we had to focus on. And that was helicopter logging. So do any of you remember when there was a helicopter flying around? And that really, I never seen an operation like that. And it was amazing. It was such a clean end product. So because of the nature of Armstrong Woods Road and all the hairpins and how narrow it is, they couldn't physically get a logging truck up there, and they couldn't have any of the ground support vehicles for the logging truck. And because of that, it was just a really clean. We had very little erosion because of the work. And it was just, yeah, it was by far the best kind of tree removal work I've ever seen.
How much do you estimate the helicopter logging cost, and who paid for that?
It's a lot. It's very expensive. It was when the helicopter was actually running. It was depending on the type of helicopter, it was $3,000 to $5,000 an hour, and that was all a contract that Cal OES had in place. So it was state budget, but it wasn't coming out of state parks. And then we were doing a lot of fuel reduction along strategic evacuation routes, roads that would be used as ingress or egress in a future fire, and then also areas or roads that we could use as borders for future prescribed fires. So the type of tree work that I'm used to managing is 6 to 10 person crew running chainsaws, where 3/4 of them would be running saws, 1/4 of them would be making piles, and then or running a chipper, and then the foreman would be kind of taking care of their saws, sharpening them, repairing them as needed. So we did that kind of work along Armstrong Woods Road, McMahon Road. We wanted to get into the backcountry, but because of the nature of the rains this year, we didn't drive on them because we were going to get stuck and make a mess. But in the future, we're going to get back there and do some of this thinning work. And then started to wrap our heads around facility repair. We lost a water system around Bullfrog Pond. Some of the bathrooms were lost up there as well. We lost one state parks residence, and then a lot of just kind of like miscellaneous damage to other buildings from just kind of random one-off events during the fire. Next slide. So this is kind of a mess. It's hard to see for the presentation, but this is one of our suppression repair maps, and that it shows all the suppression lines and then the recommendations for how we want to fix them. Like down in Williams Creek, we had to remove a lot of berm that was created there. There's like a 6 to 10 foot tall berm just perched right next to the creek. So we had to take all of that material and drag it uphill. We brought a lot of large woody material back into the creek for fish habitat. And we had done that work previously about 6 years ago. We had a CCC crew out there who intentionally placed the large woody debris structures in there for salmon habitat. So all those structures were destroyed during the event. And so we put a lot of that stuff back. But then a lot of the other work is just grading the roads, knocking down any outside berms so that their drainage can function, replacing culverts, slashing like the hand lines so that they don't become like new use trails, and that kind of thing. And this is what the park looked like kind of immediately after the flaming front had moved through. So this is a really high quality oak woodland that we have, and you can see that the tree's scorched, but it really just consumed a lot of like the branches that used to be down on the ground, all that ashes just from that. It was consumed a lot of the grass thatch that had been building up over the years. And then that other slide on the right hand of the screen, you can see the grassland burned up pretty hot. It cause some lethal scorch on some of that coyote brush that's in there, which is a good thing because that's starting to invade into a lot of our grasslands. But you can see a lot of the trees were still green and overall fared pretty decently. Kind of as a nice mosaic fire, which is what we would really like to see in a prescribed burn. Is just kind of a mix of impacts and a mix of intensities in there. And so this is what Gilliam Creek looked like immediately after the fire. So again, we had to pull out all that debris, bring it back up onto the hillside so that it was less likely just to deposit back into the creek. We slashed it, so we took a lot of this material that was piled up here and spread it out so that it wouldn't just be bare soil and just run off in whatever rains we got. And then some of that material we were able to place back into the creek again for fish habitat. Slide, please. So that was another picture of Gilliam Creek.
Is that right?
Yep. So you can see it was a mess, but we did our best to fix it up. And from everything that I've been told and from what I've seen, the repair job did really well and it's functioning well again. So these are pictures. This was an area where a lot of hazard trees were put down. This is really close to Pond Farm. So that was that eucalyptus grove that used to be across the street from it. All of those trees were taken down because of hazardous conditions. And you can see the hand crew that we worked with coming in there, cleaning up all of the smaller diameter branches. They were making 4 foot to 6 foot by 6 foot piles, which we burned off last year. And now we have some of the large logs left, but all of that small slashing material is taken care of. And then I spent a lot of my time patrolling the park looking for hot spots. This is a little window into a tree and there's a fire burning in there. And I have a video of it and it was just shooting up out of the top of there. So we would go and identify trees like that. And if we could get water onto there, we would try our best to put it out. That particular one, we didn't have any equipment that could get up that high. So I came back about 12 hours later and the top like 20 feet of that snag had come down and I could get water to it. So I started putting that out with that rig that you'd seen earlier in the back of my pickup truck. One of the great things I learned during this event from Alan, who came down from North Coast Redwoods, was this like redwood sprinkler system. So he would have these metal, like literally just metal lawn sprinklers, and he would put them into like the basal hollows of trees and turn them on for a little while. And that was a really effective way of putting trees out. If the fire was really up high in a big basal hollow, he would rig up these 3/4 inch galvanized pipes attached to just like a 3/4 inch garden hose, and then had like a nozzle on the end of it that can make a fine mist and just put that in the tree for a couple of hours. He would run a small pump off of a 300-gallon bladder bag, and just that little bit of moisture was all it would take to put that tree out, and it was really effective. Because then the alternatives is either unloading several hundred gallons using a deck-mounted water gun on an engine, or cutting a tree down. And so we wanted to not cut any trees down, and then I don't have one of those deck guns in my rig. So the sprinklers are just like this really awesome little low intensity way of putting out fire. And it's essentially just mimicking fog. It's the way I thought about it a lot.
For how long did you find those hotspots after that?
We were finding them about 2 months after the fact. They really hold the heat well. There was one really stubborn one, who was down in the roots, that took a lot of time to put out. So the ones in that snag, that was a little bit easier because eventually the fire just burned through the fuel that was available to it. But that was one of our big concerns. And down in Santa Cruz, they were having reflares, I think, into January after the lightning event. So it was happening. We didn't have anything too bad happen. So this is another one. This was one of my coworkers, so we were trying to put out the fire in this snag. This is up in the Bullfrog Pond area. And this is our little version of the sprinkler system. So it's about 20 feet of galvanized pipe attached to our 3/4 inch hose. And then our pickup truck is up the hill in one of the camp spots. And we were just, again, trying to put out the smokes. We didn't want anyone having to call fire services to bring them out here. And snags are a pretty important feature as long as there's not like too many of them per acre. So we wanted to try and preserve the snags that we're burning. This is it turned into one of our routine stops when we would come through and patrol the park. So let's go and check on the Bullfrog area. So our fuel reduction work has been continuing. We're working with Circuit Rider right now, working along Armstrong Woods Road. I had a contract with the Geysers Fuel Crew out of Northern Sonoma County Fire District. And we have contracts with some other private contractors to come in and kind of continue this work. And again, we're focusing on the areas that are most strategic to get people out of harm's way in the event, well, for when the next fire comes through, unfortunately, and then also ones that will serve as good control lines for prescribed fires that we want to implement into the future. And so, we make our small piles. These ones were made just, a couple months ago. That material is all ready to burn if the weather cooperates with us. It's been too windy the last few weeks for us to safely burn anything. But I'm hoping that we'll get some calm conditions or hopefully some rain soon too. So yeah, this is the kind of work that we are continuing on in the park.
So were you working on Sweetwater Springs in the lower park? There's
I
a
wasn't.
stretch that has been cleared and you can see the files set throughout the weeks.
I was working, so I've had a few different rounds of contractors, and we removed a lot of tan oak that had died down in the grove, like around the Colonel Armstrong tree, and kind of worked out, I call it the horse trailer road. So we had worked up that way, but we didn't make it very far up that road. And then I worked along like Armstrong Woods Road, like in the grove itself on the hillside, kind of in between Armstrong Woods Road and East Ridge Trail. But it's been a little limited down there. So into the future, Parks is going to continue a fuel reduction along strategic roadways. I have a project with the California Conservation Corps in Fort Ross, picking up on work that they had started last year, working down along Fort Ross Road. We have more plans to work along Man Road and Armstrong Woods Road, especially in the backcountry of Austin Creek, because we haven't gotten into there yet. We want to work on strategic fuel reduction to aid prescribed fires and suppression actions. So one of the things that in parks people have had to kind of wrap their heads around is picking out, like looking at the landscape through like a fire management perspective of where they would likely try and stop the fire, and really trying to wrap our heads around, if we do work outside of an emergency, like will that encourage fire services to actually put a dozer line in like on a ridge that we would be okay with it, or if they would still just put it wherever it's like most strategic and most expedient to putting the fire out. So we're really trying to wrap our head around looking at the landscape through their lens, and then working, having a good partnership with them. So, we're like, yeah, we did this fuel work along like Morrison Ridge, and we would be okay and like actually prefer for like a dozer line to get put in there kind of thing, versus just kind of responding after the fact, like, oh my God, like they put a dozer line through the best like grassland that we ever knew about, kind of thing. So that's what that second bullet point is about, is once we get away from the roads and trails system, which are the preferred because it's already disturbed, it's already been designed and gone through all the environmental review, is looking at what other landscape features we could do some good work on, and then it would both kind of like meet their mission and meet our mission of protecting the natural and cultural resources of the state. We want to use more prescribed fire, both for fuels management and for the ecological benefits. I've been here for 12 years and we've burned in Salt Point twice and Fort Ross 3 times, or twice, and then attempted a third time, but it was too wet. So we want to vastly grow our prescribed fire program. We did have a new hire, Ryan Klausch, who unfortunately couldn't make it here tonight, but his primary focus is going to be fuels management and prescribed fire. So we're building our capacity. In the next 5 years, we'll have a much more robust program. We have the option for some new trail alignments, and we're really going to look at them both for the recreational benefits of the trails, but then also using those trails strategically as compartments for prescribed fires, and then also potential suppression lines or control lines. The fire service has called them lines of convenience. So it's just like, yes, this trail is already here, fire behavior is favorable, we can just stop it here with minimal support. And we still have a lot of facilities to repair. And then we want to further our partnerships with fire agencies and adjacent landowners to really leverage the maximum benefit out of any kind of fuel treatment we have. State parks has a lot of acres that we manage, but if we could always connect, like if we could connect to a ridge top that's on private land, and then connect to a private road or a county road, something like that, then we want to work on projects that will really benefit the community as a whole. And again, it's a landscape level problem, and it really needs a landscape level response.
You say you want to do a number of prescribed burns. How many acres do you hope to treat? You've got about, what, 5,000 acres in Austin Creek or so?
Yep. And
if you do a 10-acre burn, which is pretty large, that's 500 burns.
Yeah.
Help me with how much you can get done.
So we're hoping to get up to around 800 to 1,000 acres burned a year. And it depends on the vegetation type. So and this is of course contingent on the stars aligning and our weather prescription and weather window being wide open and nothing else going along, like going haywire in other parts of the state. But so in Salt Point, just for reference, there's a 35-acre prairie kind of up on the ridge tops, and we were able to burn that in 2 hours the last time we burned it, and that was because the conditions were just really favorable, and we had nice, like I would say, low to moderate fire intensity. We had plenty of people on site, and it was just an easy burn to implement. So grassland, you can burn a lot of acres in a day if you have the personnel and if you have the prep taken care of. Forest fuels are a lot slower just because the fuels take longer to consume, and then you also don't want to get in a situation where there's just a lot to babysit, because they'll smolder and they'll smoke for potentially like a week or two afterwards. So you wouldn't want to burn a large plot and then just have like 13 smokes that you're constantly like having to go and respond to. When I started my state parks career down in Santa Cruz, and they had a very active prescribed burn program. And the year I was down there, we burned off a 500-acre plot in Big Basin. So it can be done, but it's just, it depends on the site.
In one burn, you get 500 acres.
Yeah. And that one was
grassland mostly.
No, that was all redwood.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, that one was, we started to burn it, and then conditions got kind of unfavorable. It's going to turn dry for a couple of weeks, so we would just have people patrol it. And then once the conditions turned good again, and we saw that there was a rainstorm definitely coming in, we just lit off that whole plot. We got to camp out there at night and stuff. And it was great. And that was a really good burn. There are some techniques that we were using down there that I won't use up here anymore, but that was a good learning experience. Yeah, so it can be done. It just you just have to be able to prep the site really well beforehand.
Which means, describe what do you mean by prep the site?
So for us, I would be prepping the site. If it was a forest burn, I come through and use mechanical treatment like within 50 to 100 feet of the edge, so that we weren't having any kind of really intense fire behavior, like right on the edge, sending embers like across our control line. In grasslands, our kind of MO was using a mower to mow the perimeter of it. And then that way we could drive our engines out there and like mobile the fire. And that was just a nice way of like having a small backing fire come right up to the edge and then hit like, 2-inch tall grass, and then the fire services can just put it out really easy and not use that much water up. So, and it just kind of depends on the site. There's some areas in Fort Ross that we want to burn that are so steep we couldn't get an engine down to them, so we would have to put in little hand lines, so like a 12-inch to 16-inch wide scratch line the whole way around it. I would favor weed eating uphill of it too, so you just have really no big fire behavior just like coming right up to that control line. Yeah.
When you say there was techniques that I wouldn't use anymore, you piqued my interest. I have to know.
So when we started during that burn, it was really cold and wet, and we weren't getting any kind of carry like out in just the forest floor. So we were starting fires in basal hollows, and then the heat would dry out the forest floor around it and kind of creep out. In some contexts, that is a good thing. Those basal hollows are a finite resource, so they have a lot of benefits to wildlife. And with every year that they don't have fire in them, they're just getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So there is something to be said to expanding them, but it's also making the tree more vulnerable to failure. And the managers down there at the time were comfortable doing that. This was in 2006, so they may have changed their techniques as well. But we're more on the cautious side of it, where we would want to like pre-treat and keep fire out of those features for our prescribed fire. But there's something to be said to expand those basal hollows too.
Thank you so much, Chris. We keep giving away bill bags and you people keep coming, so I've given almost one. So Chris, pick a number between 1 and 9. So we can give today's winner their bag.
7.
7. Okay, so we can find us a number 7.
Chris, it was so interesting and really encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome.
One question. On the trail, like the East Ridge Trail, are those open yet?
Not yet. They're,
What did you, do you have any anticipation?
no, I don't. Water, for better or worse, that's above my pay grade. But the issues with a lot of those trails is that the trees haven't been tested by a really hard winter, so there's a lot of random failures happening, and then a lot of the trail structures like the curb walls and some puncheons were damaged in the fire, and we haven't been able to repair all of that yet. So I know they want to open it as soon as possible, but
Was the Potter?
yeah, Margaret, that all survived. Yeah, I spent a couple of days doing structure protect around that, and we did a couple of burnout operations across the road from it to keep the fire away from it. And yeah, they put a lot of resources on that to keep that building up.
And then the trails back into Austin Creek, that's all closed off.
Yeah, what I've heard people talk about is opening. I think they want to try and open East Ridge first. Cool Ridge suffered some more damage And then the backcountry, I haven't heard of it. Yeah, that's only the residents who use Armstrong Woods Road can drive through the park. That's it.
It struck, I know she used to be my playground when I was a kid.
Hopefully it will be again soon. It's a special spot and we want to get people out there as soon as possible. It's a capacity issue.
When Walbridge was active, did you work with CAL FIRE to, can you set back fires to protect your property and like the fire?
Yeah, so we didn't have the authority to set them by ourselves, but we were tied in with the division supervisor. So my boss, Brendan, would meet with the division supervisor every day, kind of come up with a plan of what resources were going to be in the park, what kind of work we were going to try and get done, and then we would kind of support that work. On a fire, there's like the incident commander, then all the different section chiefs, and then there's sometimes branch supervisors, which are multiple divisions, and then there's like division supervisors, and they would handle like multiple miles of the fire line, but they rotate, so we're dealing with like maybe 2 or 3 different people throughout the whole incident, and then below them there's like task force leaders, and then that's all the way down to the low firefighter ones or firefighter teams. So we were able to work with the kind of middle management of the fire and help direct resources around where they go. And one of the other functions on a fire is a field observer, which is essentially just someone going out and gathering the intel to like pass it on to the fire. So like, oh, there's a water source here, there's a trail here, these are the conditions I saw, kind of thing. So we were fitting into that kind of role.